I hope everybody can hear us. Yes? Very good. As you probably saw with the last panels since we started this morning, we have been dealing with what is usually called in international relations the big bangs: war, violence, strategic competition, rising tension, and that keeps people excited. Not only people, but the mass media. We have a different panel. And my ambition for this panel is to convince you that this topic is important. There is lack of awareness about climate change. Yet, we will see, I'm sure you will see, how important, how crucial that topic is. In fact, in international relations, we usually discuss issues like China, Europe, war, and international relations theory calls that high politics. Issues like economics, climate change, food security are called low politics. Marginal, secondary, unimportant. And as I said, my ambition from this panel is actually to convince you of the opposite, that these are real issues. Think of climate change. The only threat that is both macro and micro. It threatens the planet and each of us. And you have seen the extremes of heat, drought, hurricanes, fires. Pakistan, a third of Pakistan is underwater. So part of this panel actually is to contest the way international relations not only have been conducted, but also have been taught to students in different universities, marginalizing what is real threat. Number two, that issue, climate change, is also linked to lots of other threats. Immigration. When people suffer from drought, they leave. And they go to other countries, and probably they are not welcome, so conflict starts. I was just on the eve of having the COP27 in Egypt, making a preliminary survey. Between 69% and 79% of the people haven't heard about climate change. And they don't really believe very much in it. So, in a sense, the marginalization of the issue is natural. But again, as I said, with this panel, we hope to change people's minds. And I'm actually very appreciative of the Emirates Policy Center to renew its agenda and to put for our attention such issues that are usually marginalized. what I want to do today is to discuss really with my colleagues two main issues. First, we identify the problem. What is it? Climate change, linkage with food security, linked with different conflicts. What is it? Lots of technical aspects are emphasized at this level, and we'll try to keep it as accessible as possible. So that is one big chapter that we will deal with in this panel. The second big question, and I hope you will be forthcoming in this respect, once we have this problem, and it is crucial, huge threat to humanity and to each of us, what is to be done? Is there a solution? Can we do something about finding the solution? I'm really lucky to have with me here three panelists that are not only qualified, but have huge expertise at this level. I wouldn't introduce all of them at once because the bio is really very, very rich. And I'll introduce each one when we start. The first one I'll ask to talk is my friend, Dr. Hatim Al-Shanfari. And I'll just follow the panelists in biological order, and then we will come to have interaction among all of us. And actually, one common thing about the three panelists is that they combine scholarship with policy-oriented analysis, which not many people have. So, for instance, Dr. Al-Shanfari, Hatim Al-Shanfari, is a professor of economics at Sultan Qaboos University. He is also the vice president of Oman's Economic Association. But he has been involved in lots of civil society associations, business associations, funds for investment and trade, and hence he has his hand at both levels. And I'll ask him to start our discussion by identifying the problem, why it is so important, and its different dimensions, its different impact, and especially why it has been marginalized for so long. Hatim, the floor is yours.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much, Dr. Bahgat, for your kind words. First, let me start by expressing my deep appreciation to the organizers, Emirates Policy Center, and specifically to Dr. Sam Al-Katbi for your kind invitation, warm hospitality, and nice organization, very effective organization of this important event. Let me add by saying that this is my first time participating here, and it's an honor to be with you. Hopefully I can provide something as a thought-provoking more than anything else. I'm sure most of what we were going to say is obviously known to many, but let's just emphasize some of the basic issues. By 2050, almost 30 years from today, the world population will be between 9 to 10 billion, based on the most common estimates. Those 9 to 10 billion people need to be fed. And this is a big challenge, given the climate changes and what is presenting in terms of food productivity and the loss of land and the impact that has been added to this in terms of conflict. The conflict, the current one in Ukraine, with high energy prices and lack of supply of food, is presenting a very, very challenging issues to the food security as well as adding to the climate change. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, particularly number 2, that emphasize reducing food security, increasing nutrition, and increasing access to food for everyone, is going to be a major challenge going forward. So here we have an international goals that has been set by United Nations. The speed of climate change is not helped by the conflict. High energy prices, lack of supply is adding up to this huge challenge that we are facing currently on the global scale. Are we at the tipping point where we are seeing the warming up getting close to 1.5 to 2 degrees, and that can create huge problem in terms of loss of agricultural land, in terms of change in the nutrition, the food that we are producing? The globe is not as it was years ago, and it's going to change. This has an impact on the nutrition of the food that we are producing, and that has an impact on the health of the population in the world. The ambition to reduce emission to zero by 2050 is not helped again by the conflict. The conflict is throwing serious challenges to the climate change in many ways. And the conflict with the climate change, energy supply, has impacted the food security, and this is a very deep impact that we will be living with for a long time. How we deal with this? Technology can play an important role. Technology in a way that can help to increase the agricultural productivity is a very serious issue, and that can help a lot. But that's not going to be enough by itself. Technology can offer solutions.
Hatim will come to the idea of how to deal with
All right.
it. Let us just identify the problem so that our colleagues here can just follow.
Again, just to summarize, the conflict has been a serious issue, a serious problem that we are living with. Impact on agriculture and agricultural productivity, having to meet the United Nations goal for sustainability, and the energy crisis in terms of what we are experiencing currently is definitely adding to the climate challenge there. So let me stop here.
Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Alice Hill, again, confirms that idea of people working at both levels, scholarship, and at the same time, policy-oriented analysis. She has started her life as a judge and then went on to be involved at different levels, including in the National Security Council during the Obama period. Just your ideas about the problem, and are we really exaggerating by saying it is a huge threat to both humanity and to us as individuals?
Well, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Ebtissam, for having me. It is a real honor to join this dialogue. I just came from our 27th Conference of the Parties, held in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Now, representatives from almost 200 countries were present, 30,000 people. There was some bad news issued before that conference. Despite having met for 27 years under the UN Framework Convention for Climate Change, emissions, harmful greenhouse gas emissions that form that kind of blanket around the globe and heat us up, are anticipated to increase by 10%. We also heard that from the UN, there is no credible path to achieving the 1.5 degrees Celsius stated ambition from the Paris Agreement. And we've also heard from the UN scientists that for every 1/10 of a degree that we go above 1.5, there are exponentially worse consequences. At the COP, most of the discussions continued to focus on cutting emissions. And that's, of course, important. We need to prevent the harmful consequences of climate change. What tends not to get discussed is what do these consequences mean for us? What do they mean for human security, for health, the economy? You know, there's recent scholarship that says our modeling on the cost of the transition to green energy, the economic modeling, is very strong. The economic modeling as to what increased droughts, floods, sea level rise, wildfires will mean is much poorer. We don't pick up that many people won't be able to work outside in very hot conditions, that kids don't go to school and we lose out on education, that disease vectors change. So we're not picking that up. At COP, however, Pakistan had a booth. Now, we've referenced that Pakistan has had an extraordinary year. It started with a terrible heat wave. Actually, India also suffered the similar heat wave. Very serious. And of course, much of the country is not air-conditioned. So that's life-threatening in some instances. And then, this summer, torrential rains. Now, rains covered about 1/3 of the land mass of Pakistan. 33 million people affected. 2.1 million homes destroyed or damaged. Pakistan is not a rich country. It lost 13,000 kilometers of roads, 3,000 kilometers of railway, 410 bridges. People lost their lives. Now, in 2010, Pakistan had terrible flooding. And during that time, the government struggled to respond. And that moment gave an opportunity for the Taliban in Pakistan to expand its territory. So as we see these kind of extreme events hit nations across the world, and by the way, no nation is protected, but some have greater protections. My country enjoys greater flood protections. So we may see economic damage, but we're better prepared for these events. We will see instability grow. We will see extremism grow. We will see greater deaths and economic imbalance exacerbated. You'll also probably see a turning inward as migration pressures increase. People will move in country with an acute event, a flood, if they don't have a home, or a slow-moving event like a drought, where there's just no fresh water left. We'll see impacts on women and children in particular, the most vulnerable, and that has already begun to play. When you start talking about our food systems, it becomes very scary indeed. And Pakistan's a good example of that. Pakistan saw 15% of its rice crop destroyed. Pakistan is a major exporter of cotton. It saw 40% of its cotton crop destroyed. And this fall, it's a question how the wheat will go. They are anticipating that there'll be hunger. And what happens in Pakistan won't stay in Pakistan. In fact, that is the slogan borrowed from, I think, my country's Las Vegas, our gambling center. But in this case, they changed it to say that the terrible events, the suffering, the misery, the loss of livelihoods that has occurred in that country will occur in others. And that will, in my opinion, affect global security. That's why we heard earlier NATO mentioned that it's been very engaged in climate security. Rightfully so, in my opinion, because there are going to be big pressures as a result of these impacts that will happen, by the way. We've talked a lot about nuclear. We've talked about other geopolitical that are dependent on personality changes. This just happens. Nobody needs to push a button. Nobody needs to get angry at anyone. It's just going to happen. And that will occur even if we're successful in reaching the goal of 1.5, which looks like it's not possible now. These impacts will continue. So they have real effects in the ability of countries to feed their populations. We have only 5 major bread baskets in the world, very concentrated production of food. And if those fail, or more than one fail, there's crisis spread very widely. So to answer your questions, does this matter? I believe it matters fundamentally to the safety of everyone.
Very good. And our third panelist is Samir Saran, comes all the way from India. Again, the CV, the short CV is huge. You probably receive the emails about the ORF. Samir is president of the Observer Research Foundation, which is the top think tank in India. But actually, in his writings and publications, he is very rich in the topics he deals with. Obviously, climate change, but also cybersecurity, global governance. I don't know if you have time to go to sleep, Samir. Go on and talk to us about at least that problem of climate change.
No, I'm, first of all, thank you so much, Dr. Ibtisam. Pleasure to be back. And I can see the conference growing stronger each year, and kudos to you and your team for putting this show. I'm not going to repeat what the previous speakers have already mentioned. In some sense, I don't think I need to add to the kind of challenges we face. Maybe I can add to the intensity of what we face. One way of thinking about what could happen as we proceed down this decade, and I'm not talking about next decade anymore, I'm talking about the next 7 years. And let's see if what I say now is going to play out over the next 7 years. So I'm putting my neck out on the line. The food shock you saw when the European conflict broke out, Russia and Ukraine, you saw the inflation, you saw, boom, within a week, and 10 days you were all paying 30% more, 25% more, 50% more. This is going to happen at least twice or 3 times in the next 7 to 8 years. Not courtesy of war, but because of the shock to those 5 zones that you were mentioning, the previous speaker was mentioning, that are grain-producing zones. You're going to see changes in the next 5 years that are going to proxy conflict that we saw this summer. So you're going to see food inflation, not once, but at least a few times over the next 7 years, courtesy the planet opening up. The planet is now in conflict with its own ecosystem, courtesy the catalyst, which is the human species. So that's one way of thinking about what the climate impact would look like. It would be the lockdown during the coronavirus and the European conflict and the food inflation put together. Because supply chains are going to get disrupted, like they did during the virus. Coastal landing zones, coastal ports, coastal cities are all going to be dysfunctional or made less efficient in the coming decade. And then you have these food shocks, courtesy the climate catastrophe that is going to challenge all of us. So I think that's one way of looking at the next 7 years, and let's see if this plays out. Have we passed the tipping point? We are far past the tipping point. You know, the question that are we past the tipping point is Western hypocrisy. It's because the West does not want to pay reparations for free riding on the environment. If it agrees we are past the tipping point, then it has to help the countries which are suffering because of that tipping point. It wants to continue to delay and deny and in some sense prolong the happening of climate change so that it doesn't have to pay to the countries who are suffering for their industrialization of Europe and America. So we are way past the tipping point. I think the challenge before us is not mitigation. Of course, that is one strand so that we don't go worse, but most importantly, it is adaptation and loss and damage. It's already upon us. So let me make one. What is the central problem? The central problem is hubris and ignorance. Is human arrogance and human ignorance in a rare confluence that has been on display since at least 2009 Copenhagen. I don't know how many of you were present at COP16, COP17 or whatever it was in Copenhagen. But I remember that year particularly keenly. I was a student at that time. I was writing my PhD on climate, so I was following everything that was happening. I had hopes. But I saw something very spectacular that time, and maybe the chair can indulge with me for 2 minutes. 6 months before the Copenhagen summit, or somewhere thereabout, in London, we had the G20 leaders meet. And all of them came together and made big announcements. $500 billion, $300 billion, $100 billion to save the financial system. They all came together, put together a kitty of a few $1 trillion, and they bailed out the banks. The banks were going down and we would all be in trouble, and we all came together and we put a few $1 trillion to save the financial system. 6 months later, the same year, 2009, 100+ leaders meet in Copenhagen, including those alpha males who were throwing the numbers into the orbit. Even they corrected 6 months later in another conference venue, this time to save the planet. They could not agree to even commit $100 billion. They committed to do that after 11 years. And now it is 14 years, it's not happened. So first of all, I don't think, if people are unaware, you mentioned a number, that 65 to 60 to 70% of the people don't know climate change. Guess what? Even the leaders don't know, because they don't behave that way. Making green speeches does not mean that they understand that climate change is real, up close, personal, and a clear and present danger. So to me, I think we all know what climate change is going to be like. None of us want to get to that place where we need to respond to it, because that means challenging the way our elections are fought, our democracies are organized, authoritarian regimes are strengthened. We'll have to change all of that if we have to agree to act on climate change.
We'll come to that. I'm asked to finish that panel much earlier than expected because of the delays we had this morning. We started late, and we still have 2 panels. But we will still deal with the basics. I want just to add one important aspect to the identification of the problem that my colleagues have emphasized. And this is related to the region we live in. Part of the problem of climate change is global warming. The Middle East is going to suffer, or is suffering already, 20% more in higher temperature than the world average. What does that mean? It means rise of seawater. And the result is that some cities by the coast, like Alexandria, can disappear, can be simply flooded. So even if the world doesn't care enough about climate change, we here have to put it as a priority. I'm sorry for the bad news. Please don't kill the messenger. We are just informing everybody about the priority of climate change as an issue. I want to jump now, right away, after identifying the problem. What is the solution? What can we do? If we are all threatened, as I said, this is really the only threat that is both macro, threatening the planet as a whole, and micro, threatening each of us. If we agree on that, what can we do? Not only as specialists, but also as citizens. Each of us, what can we do? And again, Hatim, you started dealing with that, and I interrupted and said, we'll come to it.
Yeah.
Now you have the chance to give us ideas about these solutions.
Yeah. The solution cannot be a single source. It has to be multiple sources, and it has to be coordinated very well to get the results out of it in any meaningful way. I would say technology has a lot to offer, but that's not going to be enough. Technology in terms of increasing agricultural productivity is critical. Increasing the ability to control emission is technology can offer some solution, but again, it's not going to be a determinant solution, but it is going to be definitely helpful in many ways. The other issue here is to do with the policy making on global, because whatever happens, it cannot be handled in one single source, whether it's location geographically. So the whole countries in the globe has to come together and has to be convinced. But what is the mechanism of enforcing? That's the problem here. Countries, as you have been experiencing, can meet and commit billions of dollars or so much of the policies. But who's there to check to see this has to be enforced and has to be taken forward? This is, again, a big issue here that we can see on the nation scales and for activists on the ground who are trying to look at these issues and desperately fighting huge currents that they cannot overcome easily. Tipping point, as you mentioned, that we are beyond it. If that's the case, and that's not a good motivation, what else can be a good motivation? That we need to hold back and try to fix what can be fixed now, just to do whatever repair that we can do. Otherwise, we'll be getting to the point of no returns, and the economic cost behind it is just extraordinary. It's not going to be affecting one country, but the whole globe. And what we are doing in terms of damage and insisting on not fixing it effectively is definitely adding up and accumulating this problem going forward. I just need to stop here and then pass it on.
Very good. Alice, jump in.
Yes, well, if we're going to focus on the food aspect of climate change, we can look at agriculture. Now, with agriculture, we have a challenge because agriculture is also a major source of the harmful greenhouse gas emissions. So as we think of solutions to protect our sources of food and how we grow and raise that food, we need to be thinking also, can we make sure that we are reducing the emissions so we don't have those 1/10 of a degree increases in global average warming? But the good news is that there are lots of solutions out there when we start talking about agriculture all along the food chain, from growing the food to transporting it and to consumption. So when we're talking about growing food, some of this is occurring in the Middle East. Vertical farming, improving our irrigation system so that we lose less water as we farm. Making sure that we're looking at crops that are prepared for or genetically modified to reduce salination. If we have more salt water entering, that they can grow healthily. They can grow more closely together. All sorts of ideas and things in progress to help. Then there are financial aspects, insurance. In Kenya, there's been a lot of experimentation with smallhold farmers, in not giving them payouts after the crops are destroyed, but giving the farmers payouts before the rains hit, before the flood comes, so that they can move their livestock to safer areas, they can make sure that they have protected their homes to be better prepared when the floods leave. And we know that if you spend $1 in my currency in advance of a disaster, you can save somewhere $6, $8, $10 in recovery costs. So those insurance mechanisms are very valuable. Also loans in advance to help farmers. And then if we move on to transportation, we can look at creating nodes that make more sense so they're and are better protected as we go forward, thinking through what that supply chain looks like and better protecting it from, for example, a rail track that gets washed away and then cars sit on the side of the track and the food rots. And then you can get to actual consumption where we eat less meat. That would be one way to cut down on our emissions, but also where we start looking at making sure that we're not wasting food because we've done we've just made our supply chains that much more vulnerable if we're in the habit of wasting a lot of food. Tons of solutions out there. Have we adopted them yet? I think that's pretty piecemeal. But as the crisis becomes more obvious, as more people experience it firsthand, it's likely that these will become much more mainstream approaches to keeping us all safer.
So the good news, tons of solutions are there. There are solutions.
There are solutions.
Okay. One of the big problems is that there are promises, especially financial. Samir started talking about that. They have never been implemented. Just one example, a few years back, they estimated that for the mitigation of impact of climate change and adaptation to its problems, we need $100 billion a year to compensate some of the countries that are very affected. Not even 1/10 of that money has been paid to these countries. And the cost is rising. Samir, I have statistics here about the cost. You started that. Perhaps you can now develop that idea.
No, I just want to share the optimism of my previous speaker on the good news part. I fear that we will all go to hell with good news in our hands. We are going to do nothing about it. The challenge is that our last breath, we would still think that we have something good news waiting for us. We would not have done anything about that good news. Let me give you another good news. Good news is that the world has never had such a large war chest. We have hundreds of trillions of dollars of surpluses. We are talking about close to $500 trillion of global surpluses if you count all the funds and the private capital and the savings. What do we need? We need $6 trillion every year between now and 2050 to move to a net zero framework that the world is trying to achieve, for example. That's all we need, right? That's the number we are talking about. That is what we need every year if we have to move to a green future and do no more damage. I'm not talking about the loss and damages already caused or the adaptation challenges that exist. To do no more harm to the planet, we need this money, which means that we need barely a fraction of a percentage of return on the surpluses to invest in green transitions. It's such a small amount. Why should we even be having this conversation when we know the economic outcomes? And in the US, you have 25 institutions who have done various studies that tell you that net zero is net positive. And it adds to GDP, adds to growth, adds to employment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not even going there. Let me tell you the reality. So we know the good news. Now let me tell you the reality. Reality is that we require 6 trillion, and we are not even generating today 600 billion, a tenth of that as green finance for green transitions. Let me tell you another good news, or rather the lack of good news. Out of that, only 10%, under 10% of that $600 billion is going to the fragile states and to the island nations, to the island economies. Out of that 60 billion, more than 50% is being given to them as debt. So now listen, this is what is happening. You have islands going down because of rising sea levels, and they're going down with debt. So your debt is drowning in the islands you're putting money into. Now that is not good news, clearly, right? So the point here is, what can we do? I propose a 4-point solution on what should be done. Number 1, every climate fragile state has to be given a complete debt write-off, the way you gave to your financial institutions in 2009. It is going to be peanuts compared to what you gave to your banks. Please write off all debt of all countries who are currently under debt traps, so that they can build smart, resilient infrastructure, supply chains, and habitats for their people. And for that, start giving loans on infrastructure financing costs and not on the political risk costs that today you impose on these countries. Today you charge them exorbitant interest rates if they live in a country such as Maldives, for example, versus what you would give to an unviable and likely to fail project in the United States of America, Europe, or any other developed country. So I think number 1, a whole financial rejig where we write off loans and we reinvest in creating smart infrastructure for the future, which includes resilient supply chains that you were mentioning, nodes and hubs, and creating a certain degree of circularity so that we can get over climate catastrophes that are bound to strike us. Number 2, on food, we have to realize that it is not all grim. Many other regions are going to become the new producers of grains and crops that are critical to our well-being. Are we thinking about creating supply chains to reach those new regions? Do we have export facilities out of those regions? Start bringing your ports to where the food is rather than bringing the food to where the port is. We have to be smart in planning our food supply chains for the future. Global warming is going to be great for some regions in terms of agriculture and food production. In fact, I have been to a greenhouse just outside my college in Cambridge, where they had created a 800 parts per million ecosystem. They were doing well. The plants were doing well. The bees were big. Humans can struggle, but the planet will survive. So now, if you want to survive, you have to be far more nimble and agile, and you have to go to the source that will deliver you, rather than assuming that the source will move to you. I think we have to get over human arrogance and rethink our design. Number 4, and I will move fast here, we have to go back to the community. I think we have allowed technology to determine our behavior for too long. Tech determinism is as much a bane as it is a boon. We have only seen it as this great deliverer of benefits. We have not realized that it has also changed the way we interact with our ecosystems and our environment. I think we have to now somehow turn back to the age-old traditional millets, for example, in terms of your food systems, in terms of how do we keep things cool, the mud and earth made homes rather than the mortar and bricks and steel that we have dumped everywhere in the world. We don't want a Shanghai in every city, every country of the world. We want every country. Someone mentioned in the previous panels, celebrate diversity. Well, diversity has to be celebrated if you bring communities to the forefront of how their future should look like. Go back to the old knowledges, revive it. Modern science has to keep, in some sense, a responsibility of bringing traditional knowledge with it. Modern science, which is monolithic and ignores geographies and demographies, is dangerous. And I think there has to be a marriage and a fusion of modernity with tradition. That is fourth. And final. I think we are creating single points of failure. And that is my biggest worry. And we saw this during the pandemic. When China shut down, we were all struggling with all sorts of inputs in our life, from our toothpaste to our toothbrush to our, to our simple air filters to everything. Guess what? China is your single shop even for climate response. You want mitigation? Go to China. You want digitalization? Go to China. I think this idea that you can have these concentrated zones of manufacturing and production and services and platforms that will save the entire planet is very, very dangerous. Small is beautiful. We should now not try to create that model of these big manufacturing zones and hubs. We should have decentralized, smaller, smart manufacturing units that allow us to serve each other when one or two of them are down. Today you have a single point of failure. That single point of failure, first of all, is contributing to climate change, and it's going to let you down when you need to respond to it. Think about it. So I would caution. And this is not from a zero-sum geopolitical analysis. This is from a very systems analysis. That today we are all relying on one geography to deliver us. I think we need many more geographies to kick into play. Let us think of which those 5, 7, 10, 15 new geographies can be. Let us build our capabilities there as well, so that we don't have to go through what we did for 2 years during the pandemic.
Very good, very good. So, at least we can start by some of the financial aspects that can be carried out immediately. One of the objections is that some countries from the global north say that's too much. Actually, I was comparing with the military budgets of some of the countries. Russia, after invasion of Ukraine, annual budget, 150 billion per year. NATO countries, 363 billion per year. US, 801 billion per year. The financial aspects we are talking about, whether it is debt relief or adaptation or mitigation, is minute compared with the danger, right? So, one perhaps piece of good news is that there is awareness now of the problem of climate change. I remember when I started teaching international relations and I talked to students about climate change, some say to me, let us talk about real international relations. Now I see that Columbia University, for instance, has established a climate school. I see that there are lots of examples of awareness about climate change. The number of delegates, and especially of civil society, that have been attending the COP27 and certainly will come to COP28. Yes, I'm hurrying up. Dr. Ibtisam. Is an excellent example of being on track to cope with climate change. The president is hurrying me up to finish. I'm sorry I can't take questions. I'm sure that you have comments and questions to raise about that important subject, but I hope that this panel has convinced you that we have a real problem, a real threat to the planet and to each of us. And if you are convinced, please work to mitigate its effects and prevent that threat from being a real killer. I learned a lot from this panel, from my colleagues, and I am sure that you did too. So, with this note, let us finish this panel too early.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.